The study I chose for this project is called The Effect of Clean Cooking Interventions on Mother and Child Personal Exposure to Air Pollution, Results from the Ghana Randomized Air Pollution and Health Study. Its overall purpose was to assess the effect of two clean cooking interventions on the personal exposure of women and children in Ghana. It was a cluster randomized intervention trial to test the effectiveness of cleaner biomass stoves and cooking methods in communities in need. Their method used was to separate 35 clusters of 38 communities that were then randomized into three different study arms. The first was control, second was cleaner biomass stove, and the third was clean cooking fuel. Women who were said to be eligible had to be carrying a live intrauterine singleton fetus and in their first or second trimester of pregnancy, which is equal to a gestational age of 24 weeks or less. They had to be the primary cooks of their households, as well as non-smokers. The first intervention arm was carried out by providing households with two BioLite home stoves that had fan-efficient biomass burning cook stoves. These stoves are known to improve the heat transfer through improved geometry and increased combustion efficiency through thermoelectric power fan circulating air through the combustion chamber. The second intervention arm was using liquefied petroleum gas, which I will be referring to as LPG for the remainder of the presentation. Households got one 2-burner LPG stove and 2 LPG cylinders. To measure exposures, the study used carbon monoxide as a proxy for PM2.5 exposure, due to its affordability. After beginning, they did receive some supplementary funding to actually monitor personal PM2.5 for the majority of the participants at 2 time points after the intervention. A noted limitation was that since this funding came after, they did not get a PM2.5 baseline recording. They believed that individual level exposure analysis would work to monitor personal exposure. The goal to monitor participants was to attribute exposures to individuals to enable exposure response analyses. There were baseline exposure measurements after enrollment and prior to stove interventions. Then, there were 3 additional post-intervention exposure assessments over the timeline of the mother's pregnancy at about 9, 6, and 3 weeks prior to delivery. After birth, mothers and children were assessed for carbon monoxide exposures at 1, 4, and 12 months post-delivery. As you can see in the timeline on the slide, there were the 2 additional PM2.5 measurements at 9 weeks prior to birth and 4 months post-delivery for a subset of mothers. There were 4 main statistical methods in analyzing the data collected. The first approach was across study arms that looked at post-intervention data. The goal was to estimate the difference in study arm mean 48 hours exposure compared to the mean in the control arm. The second was the before and after approach, which looked at all the data, study arm by study arm. The goal here was to estimate the difference in mean 48-hour exposure compared to the baseline recordings. The third was called difference in differences, that looked at all the data as well. This was to estimate the difference in mean 48-hour exposure observed in the post-intervention period from the baseline period compared to the same difference in the control arm of the study. The fourth and last was the session-specific difference in differences that used all the data observed. The goal here was to estimate changes in sessions compared to changes from baseline in the control arm. Results showed many conclusions. First, the LPG stove significantly reduced personal carbon monoxide exposure as compared to the control 3-stone fire. PM2.5 exposure was lower in the LPG study arm as compared to the control in the post-intervention period. In addition, there was no attenuation of the intervention effect during the prenatal period among LPG stove users, but there was some attenuation after birth. Lastly, the fan-assisted biomass stove intervention did not lead to statistically significant reductions in carbon monoxide or PM2.5 exposure as compared to the control. Numerical conclusions showed that mothers in the LPG study arm experienced 47% lower mean 48-hour carbon monoxide exposure compared to control arm using pre- and post-intervention data. And they also showed 32% lower mean 48-hour PM2.5 exposure using post-intervention data. On the other hand, fan-assisted biomass stoves did not reduce carbon monoxide nor PM2.5 exposure using post-intervention data. I have some statistics here that make it quite understandable why particulate matter inhalation is a problem of global concern. Household air pollution, or HAP, causes 1.6 million premature deaths and 60 million dailies, or disability-adjusted life years, annually. According to the World Health Organization, there are many non-communicable diseases that result of chronic inhalation of household pollution. The main ones are stroke, coronary heart disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and lung cancer. The problem is of particular concern in lower and middle-income countries. It affects women more than men, as they are generally the ones carrying out the cooking practices in the house. Children are also of high concern. Half the deaths due to HAP-related pneumonia are of children under the age of 5. Worldwide, 3 billion people rely on biomass fuels like charcoal, animal dung, or crop residues for cooking and heating. These methods lead to inefficient combustion from burning biomass fuels in open fire, as well as very high levels of air pollution and environmental degradation. Although the direct human health consequences are very severe, there are also impacts on health equity, development, and climate change related to using inefficient biomass fuels within households. First, gathering fuels daily leads to limited ability to partake in productive activities, lowering income and time availability to work. Oftentimes, children are responsible for these roles, leading them to losing time in school. In addition, black carbon and methane emission from inefficient stoves are incredibly powerful environmental pollutants that have an effect on global climate change. Such high use of these mechanisms represents a lack of access to electricity for 1 billion people around the world. Those in this situation use kerosene lamps for lighting. Many of their money-making activities like crafts and trading require proper lighting. This also limits children's ability to study and learn in school. Lastly, such methods may lead to burns, injuries, and poisonings, further worsening their situations of lost time. In order to create a proper research plan that should be taken next, the biggest study limitations need to be addressed. First, when the study was conducted, carbon monoxide was understood to be a good proxy for PM 2.5 exposure. However, more modern and developed evidence showed that it may actually perform poorly as such a proxy in HAP studies. I mentioned this above, but there was also no measurements of PM 2.5 exposure at baseline, which limits the ability to analyze cross-sectional post-intervention PM 2.5 levels. Secondly, ambient air pollution was not measured at all. Lacking this information could have limited the ability to determine the relative contribution of a household's own cooking practices from the community-level pollution to personal exposure. The study had these interventions in certain households, but noticed that it is hard to have entire populations transfer over to efficient stove usage, making cross-ambient air pollution a possibility in assessing personal exposure. Thirdly, the study carried out only limited field measurements. They noted that more extensive pretrial testing would probably have been valuable to establish more solid practices for data collection, cleaning, and analysis. This would have also established more reliable internal and external validity for exposure estimates. After addressing study limitations, to create a research plan that more properly suits the needs of the community and allows for better collection of data, I came up with 3 areas that require particular attention. First, since movement towards distribution of equipment has shown positive results, this process should be sustainable, bringing in more benefits than negative outcomes. For example, Ghana is currently moving towards branded cylinder recirculation model, in which community members need to exchange their empty gas cylinders in order to receive new ones. This also includes ensuring proper refilling practices and correct disposal of empty and no longer usable cylinders. Second, we need to ensure a long-term reduction of exposure. It is clear that LPG initiatives have shown lower intake of PM 2.5, but how can we make sure that people keep up the usage and not switch back to their old ways? A lot of Ghanaian residents are fearful of new products. They are scared of accidents and or their ability to use the LPGs. These fears create negative perceptions that would deter them from using them in the first place. To address these, cooking demonstrations should happen at the community level about proper use of LPGs, as well as communicating all the enablers of usage. Many users of LPGs have noted that it has allowed them to better multitask, cook faster, make better tasting food, as well as increase male involvement in the cooking process. The third point is ensuring that issues of affordability and accessibility are avoided. In particular, making sure the supply of refill tanks as well as pricing is a proper level for community access. Many Ghanaians in past interventions reported having financial constraints to refilling gas tanks. In addition, they reported not being able to cover costs of transportation due to the distant locations of refilling stations in relation to their houses and towns. To ensure these issues don't impede on accessibility to LPG usage, future interventions need to have better distribution of refilling stations. Another possible solution would be to establish delivery plans among communities. This method would save people time as well as transportation costs. Financial barriers should also be addressed by proper government action in the form of regulatory framework. This could be subsidizing LPGs, removing taxes, or creating microfinancing programs. These programs could offer credit bought for LPGs. An important step in also addressing gender equality in terms of financial inclusion would be giving women access to bank accounts. As the main cooks in the household, that would be responsible for staying up to date with LPG cylinder refills. Taking into account all the points I mentioned in the last few slides, a community-based intervention of clean cooking fuels would be of great benefit to communities dealing with high levels of PM exposure from inefficient cooking and heating methods. The goal would be a widespread adoption of LPG stoves with minimal blockage from lack of affordability and accessibility. Identifying main stakeholders in this process is of key importance. These include policymakers for organization and funding, community leaders for education and the creation of trust, as well as hardware producers for sustainability and reliability. The final aim or goal would be a nationwide adoption of efficient cooking methods. Communities would adopt these steps one by one, leading to a widespread common goal of a full elimination of inefficient and unhealthy burning of biomass fuels within the household.